Over the past generation, God has been thoroughly erased from our history books. The spectacular and inexplicable miracles that our nations experienced and thanked God for are being removed from the historical record. What happens to a nation that forgets its own history with God?
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the program. We've passed some important anniversary dates for World War II, 80 years on from the miracle at Dunkirk, and then more recently there was the anniversary of the D-Day landing as well. Quite a few miraculous events associated with those historical events going back to Dunkirk 80 years ago. The entire nation, the UK, Great Britain, the entire nation paused for a day of prayer. Shops were closed, and the Church of England, the Catholic Church, the Jews, other religions, they stopped doing everything they were doing and appealed to God for help. This was a time when locking everything down was done so that we could cry out to God. Here's an example, or rather a newsreel from back at that time, 1940. Just take a look at this.
The Empire responds to the King's call, and at Westminster Abbey, heart of the Empire, the statesmen, the soldiers, the ambassadors, and hundreds of ordinary men and women join the mighty congregation. Her Majesty Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands arrives a few moments before their Majesties. No one here today could foresee the grave news that has come from Belgium. All the more, it is well for us to show the world that we still believe in divine guidance, in the laws of Christianity. May we find inspiration and faith from this solemn day.
That's a newscaster saying that it's well for us to show the world that we still believe in divine guidance. We believe in the rules, the laws of Christianity. This is what so many people in Britain 80 years ago were seeing on the news. This was coming from commentators. This was coming from politicians. This was coming from the leading voices of the day. Dunkirk, as you know, that just could have ended in disaster. In fact, many people thought that it'd be good just to get maybe 40 or 50,000 of those British soldiers back to safety. As it was, something like 330 or 340,000 soldiers were saved, miraculously so. This is from the Daily Telegraph at that time, 1940. It says, "Those who are accustomed to the channel testify to the strangeness of this calm." There was a calm across the channel as all of these vessels were able to go back and forth to save these soldiers who were trapped. It says they are deeply impressed by the phenomenon of nature by which it became possible for tiny craft to go back and forth in safety. I have talked to officers and men who have gotten safely back to England, and all of them tell of these two phenomena. The first was the great storm which broke over Flanders on Tuesday, May 28, and the other was the great calm which settled on the English Channel during the days following. So there was a great storm that effectively grounded the German aircraft. And then there was a great calm that allowed for all of these ships, these boats in some cases, to go back and forth across the English Channel to save tens of thousands of British soldiers, to save the British Army. Winston Churchill, he called it a miracle of deliverance. Let me read to you what Richard Palmer, he works at our website, thetrumpet.com, and he wrote recently, "After the evacuation massively exceeded expectations, the nation returned to church for a day of Thanksgiving on June 9th. So before the evacuation, they shut everything down and appealed to God for help. They cried out to God for help. Then on June 9th, 1940, they returned to the churches to give God thanks for the miracle. It says, one thing can be certain about tomorrow's Thanksgiving in our churches, wrote the Telegraph. From none will the thanks ascend with greater sincerity or deeper fervor than from the officers and men who have seen the hand of God, powerful to save, delivering them from the hands of a mighty foe who, humanly speaking, had them utterly at his mercy. That's from the Daily Telegraph, 80 years ago, writing about that miraculous deliverance. Let's turn over to Matthew 16. This is a passage I went to just recently, but I want to emphasize something a little bit differently in the context of this subject. This is history not that long ago, 80 years, and it's important to remember history. All through the Bible, in fact, God keeps telling the Israelites in the Old Testament. He told Moses, now you make sure and you go tell the parents, go tell the adults, the older generation, to teach their children and their grandchildren to make sure they remember. We don't ever want to forget these miracles from God. We want to pass them down so our children grow up and appreciate what they're a part of, who they are. It's their identity, after all. How many people remember this history that we're talking about here today? Just a couple of examples. We pass these anniversaries every year. This is Matthew 16 and verse 1. It says, the Pharisees also with the Sadducees came, tempting, desired him that he would show them a sign from heaven. And Christ's response to this, you can see the parallel version in Mark 8. He sighed deeply, or he groaned in his spirit. He basically said within himself, here they go again. Here is this carnal human reasoning. And the Son of God is right there in their presence. God on earth. God in the flesh. And they kept pestering Christ, and they kept trying to trip him up. They kept trying to trick him. And of course, they persecuted him as well. Verse 2, it says, and he answered and said to them, when it's evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. Oh, you hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky, but can you not discern the signs of the times? You can forecast the weather, but can't you understand the signs of the times? This was the subject of a program we played for you recently. And if you think about this work that you're a part of, if you're going to thetrumpet.com or subscribing to our Trumpet magazine, this is really the forecast, the accurate forecast that you need to understand the signs of the times. You could say that the Trumpet is like your early warning forecast, your early warning. Tomorrow's news today. Hopefully you're a subscriber. If not, you can subscribe today. Call our operators during the break or at the end of the program. There's no cost or follow-up, no obligation. But look at this next verse. Verse 4, it says, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and there shall no sign be given unto it, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. Notice the word there, adulterous. A wicked and adulterous generation. In other words, these are people that, if you went back far enough, religious people that had a history with God. They were married to God. That's what Christ is getting across here. Look, you have this incredible history, and you've forgotten it. You've drifted far from God. And the same could be said for our nations today. The United States, Great Britain. We've had another author at the Trumpet magazine talking about Great Britain and how that no modern nation has had so many life-preserving miracles. They're just all over British history. If you read through and study the history, it's filled, he says here, with irrefutable examples of God-given deliverance, like Dunkirk. That's just one of many. One of many examples. Now, let's fast forward from that history to today, to the anniversary that we passed a few weeks back. 80 years on, and here we're reading from the same publication, the Daily Telegraph, and notice the title, "The Dunkirk Evacuation Was No Miracle, Oh, so now it's different. Now God's hand was not involved. Now we know 80 years later that God really didn't intervene. One wonders if this author, he's a prominent historian, by the way, one wonders if he even believes in God. I guess if he does, he just believes it's all hands off, that God really hasn't had anything to do with human history these many thousands of years. It says here on the 26th of May, 1940, Operation Dynamo, the mission to rescue the British Expeditionary Force from France began. The Dunkirk story is now legendary. The qualities of courage and resilience in the face of extreme adversity are part of our identity, how we think of ourselves. This is exemplified by the little ships, the story of how a civilian armada helped save an army. I mean, this is legendary. This is history. You don't ever want to forget this. But then notice what he goes on to say. Some say it was a miracle, an event so extraordinary that it surpasses all human powers. The truth is far more gutsy and practical and utterly remarkable. It was an almost superhuman effort conducted by ordinary men and women. In other words, God didn't have anything to do with it. And he says his version of this history is even more remarkable than what the Telegraph was writing back in 1940. And I submit to you that it's far less remarkable and in fact boring. You take God out of the picture, and what are you left with? You're left with a lot of human error, a lot of human reasoning. Now, this world is in a state of chaos, and there's a lot of suffering that goes on in this world, and in one sense, there has been a hands-off policy from God as He's just let us run our course. Apart from Him, we don't want Him involved in our lives, and that's a perfect example of this. Now, there was a time when He was blessing our nations, fabulously so, because of what He promised back in the book of Genesis to Abraham and his descendants. And so there was a period where God's hand was strong, like in the Dunkirk evacuation. And there's a reason for why so many of those blessings and that timely intervention is not happening like it did before. And a lot of it is because we're so far removed from God. We don't give God thanks. We don't refer to God. My father gave a program over in the States on the modern interpretation of history, and he just talked about how that this is a very common trend today where historians will just take God right out of the picture. You can start turning over to Romans 1. We'll go through a few verses here, and as you do, let me just play for you a clip from my father's program, his recent Key of David program in the States.
By what authority do historians leave God and the Bible out of history? I mean, after all, if you're going to write like that and you're going to write a history of the country or the world, well, by what authority do they have to just leave God and the Bible out of it?
What authority do they have to just erase God from the picture, to delete God from the picture? Notice Romans chapter 1, and this is verse 19. It says, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. Now, this doesn't mean that God's revealed the whole purpose and plan that He's working out here below to every human being on earth, but there's enough there in His creation. That's what Paul's getting at here. There's enough there to show. There's enough evidence to show that God does exist and that God, He does intervene where necessary to fulfill His purpose. You heard that newscaster from 1940. We need to show the world we still believe in divine intervention and deliverance. You'd never hear anything like that today. Never. Because now we have a more modern interpretation of this history. Now we tell it differently. We just take God right out of it. And then tell ourselves, hey, it's even more inspiring, don't you know? Is it really? Is it more inspiring? Verse 21, it says, because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Another translation says they didn't honor God. It says, because when they knew God, they glorified him not. They just didn't glorify him. Instead, they removed him. And then what happens? Here's another clip from my father's program.
If you forget God and you leave God out of history, the Bible tells you you're going to have confusion. And even one prominent critic said you're going to have chaos. That's very true.
Now, the reason why this is so important is because look at the world today. You have a lot of chaos and you have a lot of confusion. And a lot of the reason for that is because we've turned our backs on God. We don't want God. We certainly don't want God's solutions. We want to do it ourselves. So much so that even in the historical record, we want to go back and carefully erase God's involvement. If you'd like a true record of the true church history, that's what I'll focus on with our free literature offer here. Please request this wonderful book here, The True History of God's True Church. And then this one here is about church history as well, recent church history. And this tells you all that you need to know about this organization that sponsors this program, the Philadelphia Church of God, and our predecessor, Herbert W. Armstrong, and how that this work the past 30-some years, we've been raising the ruins of the work that Herbert Armstrong did during the 1940s and 50s and 60s, all the way through to the mid-1980s. And then his successors came along and ruined the work, and we've rebuilt it. That's some important history that you need to know about if you're interested in God's truth. Stay tuned. Make sure you contact our operators during the break or at the end of the program and request the free literature today. We'll be right back.
Most people think, well, the historian is a scribe, that he just sits down and writes about facts. But he is not a scribe. He's a judge of what he's writing. He's a judge. And he is that final authority.
That's another clip from my father's recent program on history and what modern historians are doing, so many of them. He's the judge. He's making the final decision. Of course, you know this. The scholar is the one who decides what's covered and what isn't, what to add in, and in some cases, what to delete. We hear today so much about fake news, fake reporting, and more there's some fake history out there as well. It's sad to see. It's sad to see God removed from the story. Here's another short clip.
But the greatest crisis of all is that they omit God in the Bible. And if we don't see that today, we're soon going to see it, and I mean very soon.
That again is from his recent program. Let's continue our study in Romans chapter 1, verse 18. It says, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness." There's another translation says that they suppress the truth. They suppress the truth. This is talking, of course, about people suppressing spiritual knowledge, the truth of God. But you see the same spirit today. Many people in top positions that don't want you to know the truth. And then even when they get it all wrong, rarely, if ever, will they come back and say, you know what, we were wrong and we're sorry. They just move on to the next topic, so many of them. The greatest tragedy, as he said there, it's when they take God out of the story. Here is a case where people are holding down or they're suppressing the truth of God. That's what they do. They suppress the truth, or they omit it, or maybe they interpret it. They're the final judge. But it says there that the wrath of God is revealed. In other words, God has a pretty strong position himself on these sorts of activities. He's not happy to be erased away, and soon he's going to intervene. There is cause and effect. We take God out of our lives, we take God out of our history, we take God out of our nation, and what are we left with? Well, hopefully you're discerning enough to see that this world is in trouble. Troubles are multiplying all over the earth. And here we pride ourselves in being a modern civilization, but look at our nations. Look at what's happening to our nations. Here's my father one more time.
The historical method, as they talk about, is simply a hypothesis, quote, that God has never and does not now intervene in or determine the course of history. That's their guess. God never intervenes. There's nothing, superpower, no superpower that intervenes in this world? Absolutely not. Well, I'll tell you, He has been for over 75 years intervening in this world, and anybody ought to be able to see it and could see it and prove it if they were just willing to do so. Our work is certainly seen to that truth.
And you can learn a lot more about that if you request Raising the Ruins and the True History of God's True Church. It's inspiring. The more you get into it, the more you want to study, the more inspired you are, the more it builds your faith, the more it strengthens you spiritually. You take God out, as I say, then the story loses its interest and it becomes boring. It doesn't really strengthen and solidify your faith, just the opposite. And here again, this is a very similar point to what Paul is making here in Romans 1. Verse 22 says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. We say we're wise. We say we're scholarly, and yet we're becoming more and more foolish. That's why you're hearing so many things from people who are very well educated today. You're hearing a lot of things that are just crazy. So much insanity in the world today. Because we're not on a strong foundation. We're just all over the place, contradicting ourselves right and left. It's rare to find a scholar today who's honest, who's a seeker of truth and not going into a project aiming to fulfill his own agenda. Verse 25, it says, who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshiped and served the creation more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. This is what men do. We worship the creation instead of the Creator of the creation. And we worship ourselves. And we think we're smart. And we think we're intellectual. And yet look around, as I say. Look at the fruits of man's rule over man these past many thousands of years. One final clip from my father.
And now 55 colleges and universities required a course in American history, and 78% of them, of the students, got by without taking any history at all. It's getting boring. It's disinteresting. They've taken God out, and it's confusing. It's confusing. And the students are bored, and they just, without God, it's just confusing. It's chaotic. Thank God that God has proven Himself.
That's from his recent program. And you think about, in most universities, colleges today, a lot of students go through it without even getting history. They don't even have a history requirement in the curriculum. And then when you get it more and more, you're getting this very modern interpretation. It's very sad to see. No wonder our young people, our children are growing up ignorant of their own history, in ignorance when it comes to God and the Bible. What a difference when you compare today to just 1940, just 80 years ago. Verse 28 here, it says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. Another translation says to get all caught up into improper conduct. We don't retain God in our knowledge, then God just gives us over to our reprobate way of thinking. And that's what's led to all of the problems and troubles that we see in our world today. For the true record, the true history of God's true church, an inspiring study, request this book together with Raising the Ruins And then don't forget also to subscribe to your early warning forecast, the Philadelphia Trumpet magazine. We thank you for joining us on today's program, and we'll see you next time.